Intro to Joshua. This outline's a little more extensive than other ones I passed out. Everyone have background to Joshua? I think I got everyone covered. We'll cover some of these things. Won't get too much into the date. Deal with the date under the date and setting and that. So, and the purpose pretty extensive on the intro stuff. So we'll leave that. We won't cover that too much tonight, but we will highlight some of these things. But we are making a transition with the book of Joshua, moving into the era of theocracy. And God is setting up that once they enter into the land of promise, then they will be ruled by His law, but through the intermediary, if you will, of the priests and so on. But we'll find that they're going to move into the monarchy. And God already anticipates this, because already back in Genesis chapter 17, He revealed to Abraham that kings were going to come from his line. And so their request for a king is not going to catch God off guard, which it's interesting over and over to see that God knows what they're going to do, even as He brings them up to the promised land, land of promise. Deuteronomy, we saw before in Deuteronomy, where He acknowledged the fact that they're going to be scattered because they're going to disobey. He knows this is going to happen, yet still He is still faithful to His covenant. He still brings them in and still provides for them all that He has offered. But we're looking at the key 11 books. We've covered Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and we'll move into Joshua, then Judges and Ruth we'll look at together. We've covered extensively Leviticus and Deuteronomy only because they're so connected with the Pentateuch. So we spent a little more time on there. And we'll combine Judges and Ruth together, and we'll do the same as we travel through the key 11 books. But essentially we're looking at the 11 books that run across the top there. And then we move to 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And those are the foundational books for this study, and so we'll build everything off of that, and they progress the narrative and they keep the storyline going, and then the other books are essentially complementary to those key 11 books. And they also then move us through the different eras. When we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we'll be in the era of restoration, and we'll come to a close, but that is some time off. What we'll do with the prophets, I'm looking that more than likely I will not cover every single prophet, or we'll be here forever. But I will give you background on all the different prophets, and we'll also run sketches on many of them, just to, as far as where they fit in the overall scheme of things. So tonight I want to come to Joshua. So if you turn to Joshua chapter 1, and we'll backtrack a little bit too, to look back at some former things that happened in his life. It's interesting because when you get to chapter 1, you would think that this is the moment of his commissioning. The reality of it is, though, that Joshua was commissioned twice before we even have the introduction here in Joshua chapter 1. And so God has already been preparing him all along for this role that he was going to have. He had him fight some of the battles before they even got to the land of promise. And so Joshua was being groomed not only to be a servant, but also to be a soldier. And we'll look at how he had been commissioned beforehand, and then he is going to be, if you will, commissioned again in chapter 1. But a little bit background first. We look at Deuteronomy chapter 34, and here we have the death of Moses, the passing of the guard. And we have the death of Moses recorded for us in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 and following. It says that Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. And there the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea of the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. So God gave him a visual of the land, of what it was going to look like, but remember that God was not going to allow him to enter into the land. But we have a great shot coming up that give us a sense of Moses' perspective, this view that God granted him before God was going to take him. And it's interesting that even in the statement in regards to Moses, it wasn't as though he was fading away. Notice with me in chapter 34, verse 7, although Moses was 120 years old, when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. In other words, he was still vim and vigorous and ready to go, you know, and then, so God then took him because it was his time, right? I mean, it's just such an interesting thing we go through when I went through Acts and looking at the sovereignty of God, and as Paul will talk about his course, and he talks about David, and he talks about others who fulfilled their role, John the Baptist and so on, and you look at them and you see that when God was done with them, it's time to go, right? Task is over, it's time to come home. And so for Moses, the same. You're not taking him into the land, so this is the end of the journey for you, and therefore God takes him into his presence. So Pisgah was the headland of the rugged Abarim range of Jordan, which is ancient Moab, and skirted the northeast end of the Dead Sea by Jericho. Pisgah was also that place where Balaam offered up the sacrifices. More than likely, this was one of, if you will, the high places in Moab. But we find in Numbers 23:14 that this is where Balaam had offered up sacrifices, was on the Mount of Pisgah, but as a part of the Abarim range. And it is considered to be the highest summit, and it's identified as the present-day Jebel Siagha, and that is the Mount Nebo that Moses stood upon as he looked over the land. And so looking at the map, this is about where it's positioned, but we have a better shot of it from other pictures. But nonetheless, so we can see that he can stand on Mount Nebo. He was able to then look across. There was Jericho and all that. So he had a good view of the land, so he could see where God was going to take them, yet he was never allowed to cross over the Jordan. This is a little bit better. The shots we have plains of Moab here, we have Jordan River here, and then up at the top is Mount Nebo, and this is where Moses was going to go and look over the land. And this is a better shot of it. The view that he would have seen is standing there, looking out over the territory, the region, the land of Canaan, where God was going to take them. And God speaks to him in Deuteronomy 34:4. He says, then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So he was at least allowed to see the land, but because of that one moment, striking the rock and not giving God the glory, he was not permitted to enter into the land. But this would have been more than likely the last view that Moses saw before he left the earth. How amazing, though, that God allows him to see the fulfillment, essentially, because they were there ready at the threshold to cross over and take over the land of which they were going to do. So Joshua, if we could, the key word would be victory. The key chapter is chapter 6. This is the beginning of the conquest, and this is the Battle of Jericho, which we all know well. But this begins the, if you will, the initial start of the Holy War. I know we hear that a lot in the news these days, holy wars, but this was the Holy War, and really the only holy war that should go on. But here is the conquest of Jericho, and this was the central campaign that began in chapter 6, and then they were going to go to the south and then up to the north, but this is where it all begins. So chapter 6, key chapter, beginning of the conquest. Some of the key verses, 1:5 through 8, we'll look at that this evening. 21:43 through 45, and then 24:15, coming out of the last days of Joshua's life and his address to the people. Key characters, Joshua and Caleb, the only two spies who were still living at the time, the only two that were going to go into the land. The others were a part of the judgment and the wilderness wanderings. The geography of Joshua, the plains of Moab, Gilgal, and Canaan. Gilgal, once they cross over the Jordan, Gilgal was going to be where they established a base camp that they would go out from, and then they would spread out through the rest of Canaan. And when they accomplished their major victories under the leading of Joshua, and they conquered the key kings and important kings in the central locations, then Joshua then left it for the rest of the people to take over. And then the purpose is to record the conquest of Canaan by Israel, and therefore show God's faithfulness in making Abraham a great nation. In order for there to be a great nation, you needed to have people, which was established in Exodus. We needed to have a constitution also established in Exodus and Leviticus. They need to have a law by which they live by, something to govern them. And then you have to have land. And this is the final step in the establishing of a great nation. And again, no matter what man does, God is still going to be faithful to what he says he's going to do. Everyone catch everything? And some background thoughts for the book of Joshua. It's interesting because God gave them some instructions, some laws as to what they were supposed to do once they came into the land as far as warfare. And we'll look at a couple of those passages, but some background points of Joshua before we get in the book. Actually, Joshua's task first was that he was to destroy Canaanite power in the land. Strong fortified cities like Canaanite kings were targets of Joshua. Joshua then, once he had finished conquering them and destroying them, then he was going to hand over the rest of the task to the people as they would settle in the region, but his task was to go in there and take out the major powers. He did faithfully destroy the key cities, both to the east, and this is the first part of Joshua chapter 12, and then to the west side, 12:7 through 24a, and a total were given in chapter 12 of Joshua that there were 31 kings all told that Joshua had taken out before he left it to the people to settle in the lands. And he would follow God's instruction, not only to go and conquer these areas, but he also then distributed the land to the people, gave them their allotments and said, okay, now when you go in and settle in these areas, then your task is to drive out the rest of the inhabitants of the land. So this was a crucial task for Joshua, and God, it's just amazing how God groomed him to get there. And we'll look at sort of some of the historical statements that are given at the beginning of Joshua. I think are so important to see the nature of what his life was like. But the fact that he was a servant of Moses, and then God was going to use him in an important task of holy warfare. The second thing that Joshua was responsible for was to divide up the land among the tribes. And so we're going to find that he does this starting in Joshua chapter 13. He's going to divvy up the lands on the west side as well as the east side of the Jordan River. Remember that we had Reuben and Gad requested that they have land on the other side, to not cross over, but they wanted to stay over on the side of the plains of Moab, and so they were going to settle over there. We had Reuben, we had Gad, and we also have the half tribe of Manasseh. So half of the tribe of Manasseh is on one side, half of the tribe of Manasseh is on the other side. So once the fighting is done, then those tribes can go back and settle that region. So essentially, if we broke up the book of Joshua, we could do it this way: acquisition of land, chapters 1 through 12, and then the allotment of the land, chapters 13 through 21. And this is just a general breakdown of the book. Then once Joshua had fulfilled his task, then he would hand it over to the Israelites. Unfortunately, they were not faithful in their task. They did not destroy the rest of the inhabitants of the land. And that was the beginning of the end for them, essentially. The other thing that's important as background for Joshua was their foreign policy. You can have a nation, you got to have a foreign policy. How you can deal with other nations. And God established a foreign policy for them. In Deuteronomy 7 and 20, Israel's relationship with the other nations was laid out in detail. If you go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 7 first, and then we'll look at 20. 20 is very interesting, and I wanted to look at a couple things, but the first few verses in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, I'm going to follow along as I read them. When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God delivers them before you, and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons, because the intermarrying with them would lead to idolatry, right? And it would lead to the worshiping of these false gods of the land. Verse 4, for they will turn their sons away from following me and to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. But thus you shall do to them. You shall tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, hew down their asherim, and you should burn them, their graven images, with fire. For you are to be a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And so this was a part, if you will, of their foreign policy. When you go into this land, you are to destroy everything. Everything. Not just things, but also people. Men, women, and children. This was God's judgment on the land, and this is what they were supposed to do. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 20, it's interesting because Moses is going to lay out some laws for warfare, and NASB very graciously titles that for us, so that's kind of nice for them to do that. Gives us a hint as what is there. But what's interesting in chapter 20 is Moses is going to lay out, by God's instruction, 4 exemptions from service in military. 4 exemptions that would keep men from going out to warfare. And the essential principle behind all of these exemptions is basically, I don't want half-hearted people out there in battle. Can't have it. That's really what all of them are. And so if you walk through chapter 20, you'll see he lays out the 4 exemptions. Basically, the principle is the same for all of them. The reason is he does not want half-hearted people out there in warfare. If your heart's not in it, right, then you're not going to be in it. Not only that, but you're going to infect the people who are around you. You're going to discourage them in the midst of battle. And the first thing that God did is he's going to challenge them to be encouraged and to be strengthened. The beginning part of chapter 20, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. So see, they're going to go up against people who know warfare. They are soldiers. They are warriors. They have those that they have groomed for war. You're talking about a slave nation, right? Brought to Mount Sinai, given a constitution, numbered men for battle, but they really don't know a whole lot about a battle, and they've had a few skirmishes before they get there, but they don't know war like they're going to see war. And so therefore God says, I have some exemptions. If you're going to be half-hearted, and these are the only exemptions that you have, if you fall within these and your heart is not in it, then you do not have to go, which meant that the military service was voluntary, essentially. But God did not want other troops to be discouraged. But one of the things that I think is important for us to remember too, as we think about them going into the land of Canaan, show you something in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy. Look at with me in verse 10 and following. Now this is interesting, because you read this, you go, well, wait a minute. Chapter 7 says they're not supposed to enter into any treaties or anything, but notice what he says in chapter 20, verse 10 and following. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. What? Already in chapter 7, he says you're supposed to destroy everything. Verse 11, if it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. He's going to give them instructions on if they want to go to war, then you go to war and you destroy everything. Verse 14, only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all that is spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself. All the men were to be killed. And then you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. But who is he talking about here? Because chapter 7 said you go into the land, everyone within the borders of Canaan you are to destroy. So who is he talking about here? Because he's talking about granting them peace, when before he said no treaties. Notice starting in verse 16. Only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. So what he's talking about in chapter 20 is if there are any peoples outside of the borders of Canaan, and you're expanding your boundaries and you go outside the borders of Canaan and you go up against that city, if they're willing to make peace with you, you make peace. If they're not willing to make peace, then you go to war. But anyone who's inside the borders of Canaan, you are to utterly destroy them. You're not to leave one person alive. Verse 15, he puts it this way. Of chapter 20, he says, thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations, literally here. So if they're inside the borders of the promised land or the land of promise, they are to destroy everyone. Any city outside of that, you can make a peace treaty with them. So basically the judgment is on the land of Canaan. There are three things you need to keep in mind about this, because we think, well, man, God wants everyone destroyed. Absolutely. Three things you have to keep in mind. First, the Canaanites deserve to die for their sin. Everyone does, right? But they deserve to die for their sin. In archaeology, the things that have been dug up from that region, they were not a pretty people, right? Their sin had reached its fullness by the time that God brought the nation of Israel there. The second thing is the Canaanites persisted in their hatred of God. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 10. And the third thing was the Canaanites constituted a moral cancer that had the potential of introducing idolatry and immorality, which would spread among the Israelites, and it did, right? It did. And so for these very reasons, God said, you are to be my judgment upon them. You're going to go in there and you're going to destroy everyone there, and you're going to settle in that land, and that is going to be my kingdom upon the earth, essentially, right? His holy people, His kingdom. So with all of these things as a backdrop, Joshua's task, which was twofold, not only just conquering the major areas of the land, but then dividing up the land among the tribes. They had their foreign policy in place, Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy chapter 20. It was now time for them to go in there and take over the land. So this is the backdrop, if you will. So if you go with me to Joshua chapter 1. Starting in Joshua chapter 1, verse 1 through 12, 24, we have the conquest of the land of Canaan. We first have the preparation for war. It's interesting, first 5 chapters, essentially that is what it is getting them ready to go in and take over the land. One of the things that God is going to have them do is to be circumcised. Interesting. I mean, they're at a, humanly speaking, we'll talk about this, but humanly speaking, that they were at a great point for laying siege to the land. But God's like, no, we got to do some things first before you go in there and take it over. So there's preparation for war. And I'll just tell you, just read through the first 5 chapters and keep in mind progression, okay? Keep in mind progression. This is one of the joys of just, when you study through a book in the Bible. I was talking to my dad just a few days ago, and he said, is it not amazing the gift that we have to be able to just sit down and study the Bible? It's such an amazing gift. And it's amazing when you can start to see the path of the author and the message that God intends for you to get, and not some of your own message, if you will, reading into the passages. But read through the first 5 chapters. There is a progression there for the preparation of entering in the land. We're not going to talk about it tonight, but there is a progression there. I leave that for you to discover on your own. Very interesting. And there is a sense of progression through the book. You have the beginning part and the conflict. There's sort of a plateau, and then all of a sudden you have this other point where it hits this high point of triumph, and you have Joshua's departure, his farewell address, and it sets us really up for Judges. And then chapter 2 and the cycle of Judges. And it's not, some would present the cycle of Judges sort of being this circle that just goes around, and it's really not that. It's a spiral that keeps going down and down and down. So just some thoughts for you. But getting to the preparation, God never was thwarted by His death of His servants. So immediately at the beginning of Joshua, we're given the historical context. But God, as soon as Moses is out of the way, He's going to bring Joshua in. And obviously this was a painful time for the nation of Israel. Notice with me in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, verses 7 and 8. This is just a little interesting side note. Give it to you. You dwell on it. But it's just interesting. In 34, 7 and 8, it says this, and although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim nor his vigor abated. Verse 8, so the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then when the days of weeping and mourning for Moses had come to an end, obviously this was a traumatic moment for them. Go with me to Numbers chapter 20, because this is interesting. Numbers chapter 20. We're going to backtrack and eventually get to Genesis. In Numbers chapter 20, we have the death of Aaron. chapter 20, verse 29 of Numbers, it says this, and when all the congregation saw Aaron had died, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron for 30 days. 30 days. Now go with me to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. We'll read from verse 9 and following. This is Joseph after the death of his father. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great sorrowful lamentation, and he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. This was the traditional period of mourning, 7 days. So the fact that they spent 30 days mourning for Aaron and 30 days mourning for Moses indicates that they dearly loved these two men. These were their leaders for so many years. And the death of Aaron and Moses were so great that they went beyond the traditional 7 days of mourning. They mourned for 30 days over them, and then they got on with what they needed to do. So we find that the death of Moses was painful for them. It was painful for Joshua. Joshua had served Moses. We've seen before, Joshua had served Moses since he was a young man. So for years he was alongside of Moses. I mean, he went up on the mount with Moses. I mean, there were things that Joshua got to experience alongside of Moses that no one else got to experience. So this was a traumatic blow for all of them, and for Joshua as well, that here his mentor, if you will, the one who had discipled him all these years, was now departed, and now it's time for Joshua to take over. But God is going to guarantee him his presence in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. So we have the new leader of Israel, Joshua. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, the historical background. Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. So Joshua is going to be charged by God. He's going to challenge him to rise, to cross over. And it's interesting how many times we have reference to cross over in the first few chapters of Joshua. So essentially God is saying you are to be a crossover kind of people, which is a great principle in the first few chapters of Joshua for us. And I'll leave that because I might preach on that coming up soon. But God charges them to rise, to cross over. God's going to promise his unfailing presence to help. Verses 5 and 9. Chapter 1, verse 5, no man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you, and I will not fail you nor forsake you. Verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong, courageous, do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And God's going to give this threefold call to courage in verses 6 through 9. 3 times God's going to say, be strong and courageous. The first, he gives the reason, because of my promise in regards to the land. I'm going to give you the land, verse 6. Be strong and courageous based on God, the power of God's word. Verses 7 and 8, I love these verses. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This book of law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. So the success for Joshua is going to come in the obedience to the law of God. And it's interesting because 2 other times Joshua was commissioned. The first commission of Joshua comes in Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 through 23. The next one comes in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 23, and that is where God is going to challenge him for the first time, be strong and courageous. So here we have this threefold repetition. Again, be strong and courageous based on the presence of God, verse 9. It's interesting to me, the reference to Joshua in relation to Moses, that God referred to him as the servant, right, of Moses. It's such a great, if you will, training ground for leadership, is to learn how to be a servant. I remember Greg Laurie was sharing one time, Chuck Smith. He went to Chuck Smith, and he said that he really saw the Lord was leading him into ministry. So Chuck Smith handed Greg Laurie a mop and said, here you go. Clean the floors for 2 years and then come back and talk to me. And really, he said it was the best years for him in being trained for ministry, is learning how to serve. And so here you have Joshua, all these years of serving Moses, alongside of Moses, being his attendant. And now all of a sudden, it was time for him to be the leader of the people and to take over. But a great model and paradigm, and we see this echoed in the New Testament with the Apostle Paul and Timothy and others who were alongside of him. We really see that issue of servant leadership. But each had their distinct role. But it's interesting, even Moses needed his prep time, right? 40 years of tending sheep had to get him ready, right? Had to get him ready. So we have Joshua is going to assume the command in chapter 1, verses 10 and following. Joshua commands the officers of the people, saying, pass through the midst of the camp. Command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourself. For within 3 days you are to cross this Jordan and go to possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess it. But not only that, but the people are also going to acknowledge Joshua, and they're going to confirm his leadership. So he gives them their initial instructions in the first few, in verses 10 and following of chapter 1. But then in verse 16, we have the confirmation from the people. And they answered Joshua, saying, all that you have commanded us to, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against you, against your command, and does not obey your words, and all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. And again, they echo the words of God. Just be strong and courageous. Right? We need someone who's going to do that for us if you're going to lead us into holy warfare. And I love that. The first battle, the initial battle, there's no fighting. None. Right? God's just going to tear down the walls. And God's just going to say, look, you're a warrior. I understand that. But it's my plan, right? And we'll do it my way. And I'll let you know this is my fight. So they send out spies, chapter 2, to go spy out Jericho. It's good to know your enemies, even if God's going to fight the battle for you. But this is where they encounter Rahab, and she is going to give them shelter. They're given instructions to go. They're commissioned in chapter 2, verse 1. They're in Shittim, and they're going to be sent up into Jericho. Now, Shittim was about 7 miles east of Jordan, of the Jordan River. The interesting thing is that Jericho on the other side of the river is about 7 miles from the Jordan River. So they're in Shittim. He's going to send them over. They're going to cross and they're going to spy out the land. And there's nothing immoral about them picking Rahab's place to go to. I mean, really, there would have been no better place to go to where they wouldn't attract any attention, going to a harlot's house. If some newcomers to the land, they would sort of expect that. And so it was a strategy. It was not in the sense of they were going there for anything other than that. But they enter into her house in chapter 2, verses 2 through 7, and then the spies' intelligence, they get their information from Rahab, and this is great because she's going to be commended for her faith, but it has nothing to do with the lie she told. It's the comments that she gives in chapter 2, verses 9 and following. So they're there, the men come, they're looking for the spies. She sends them up, but notice with me in chapter 2, verse 9 and following. And this is she talking to them. She said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. That is why, essentially, her faith was praised, and the fact that she was willing to put her life at risk to help these men escape and get away from their pursuers. And she gave them the strategy, right, to go into the hills for a period until the pursuers came back in the city, and then they were to leave, and they would be safe then to head back to Joshua. And so that is what she is commended for doing that, not in telling a lie, because telling a lie is always a sin to God. Right? I mean, how many times we hear it? Well, it's just a white lie, right, as opposed to a black, dark lie. One's good, one's bad. I heard someone say one time, a little lie does the soul good every once in a while, but that's not true. So she affirms that the people are terrified, And this is an affirmation to God's promise to them. All the way back in Deuteronomy 2:25, God's word to them was this: "This day I will begin to put dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under heavens. And when they hear the report of you, will tremble and be in anguish because of you." God said, he goes into the land and prepares the people for their coming. He prepares their hearts for their coming. They are shuddering, they are terrified, and therefore when they come, they are melted from within. Deuteronomy 11:25 says this: "No man will be able to stand before you. The Lord your God will lay the dread of you and the fear of you on all the land on which you set foot, as he has spoken to you." So here we find from the very words of Rahab the harlot, God's faithfulness to his promise. I will do this, and I have done this. And so the land is set for their coming. The spies then promise Rahab in chapter 2, verses 12 and following, they're going to promise that as long as her relatives remain within her house, right, then her and her family would be spared. She was to hang the scarlet cord out the window so that they would know. But basically, she and her family would be saved. And they made this agreement with her, according, of course, with God's blessing, that this would be so. And it was all of God's providence. All of God's providence that they were going to find shelter with Rahab's house, because God intended to save her. And it's amazing because if you look at her history, she ends up marrying a priest of the tribe of Judah, and then she winds up in the line of the Messiah. How amazing is that, right? This is all of God's sovereign plan and design for her to come to faith. And so she becomes a part of the nation of Israel. And it's acknowledged in Joshua that she has remained in their midst. Chapter 6, verse 25. Joshua makes this comment: "However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she had hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out the land." So the spies are going to return back to Joshua again by Rahab's planning and design. She told them where to hide and to lay in concealment until the pursuers came back to the city, and then they were to return to Joshua and give the report, which they do in the end of chapter 2 there. And this sort of a fragment of a wall, which get a sense of what it would have been like, but many of these cities so fortified, and a lot of the homes would be built up on the top of the wall like that, and so she would have had this window out, and she would have hung the scarlet cord to indicate what part of the wall in which she resided in, and therefore they would remain safe while all the rest of the city crumbled around. So they're going to cross the Jordan. This is after spies check out the land. They cross the Jordan starting in chapter 3, verse 1, into chapter 4, verse 24. And here it's amazing because God's going to do a great work, but God is going to bring them across the Jordan, and they're going to set up memorial stones in chapter 4 as they cross over to mark this great deliverance that God has provided for them. So Israel is prepared to cross the Jordan. God gave them specific instructions that the Ark of the Covenant was to lead the people, and this is a reminder of God's faithfulness to his covenants, and also that God was going to go before them in conflict. Crossing the Jordan was to resemble the crossing of the Red Sea. So it's amazing because this is how the Exodus started, right? Crossing the Red Sea, and now here they are now crossing the Jordan, and it's almost as though the Exodus is finally complete, right? It ends just how it began. So as soon as the sandals of the priests carrying the ark touched the waters were immediately stopped, and Israel crossed over on dry ground. I love that statement. Dry ground. Don't pass that. When I was a kid in Africa, it was a very dry place. When it would rain, we'd get these downpours. It would be so warm. One of the things we used to do to play was we would go out in the rain, and we had this old tin tub, and we'd stick it out there, and it would fill up with water, and we'd go jump around it because it was so warm when it would rain. But it was interesting because we had these watering holes, and so we would go down and swim in these watering holes. But eventually they would dry up. But the first time that they had dried up, that the water was gone, the bottom was like this thick clay. And you didn't want to go walking into it because your feet would stick in it. But after a while, then it would look like really coarse, crackly skin, and then it was all flaky, and you could walk across it. But there was a period in which it was really muddy, and it was almost like it was free, like quicksand. So when actually we go swimming in the water holes, we never put our feet down on the bottom. You try to keep up to the top if you could. But it's interesting that here is all this water is held back. God pulls it back. When they walk across, it's not on mud, it's dry ground. Amazing, amazing. So after crossing the Jordan, they're going to settle themselves in a camp in Gilgal, and that is where going to be their base camp for their campaign. This is a shot of the Jordan River, and there are different sections where it's rather wide and then also points where it's pretty narrow. But where they would cross, obviously, there was a lot of water flow. Not only that, but we're also told the time of the year. In Joshua 3:15, it says this, "Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from the upstream stopped flowing, and it piled up in a heap a great distance away in the city of Adam." So up, if you will, from where they crossed the river, the water was stopped up and it was piled up there near the city of Adam, and it was held there until they crossed over on dry ground. But this was during harvest time. This is when it was overflowing its banks. Right? This wasn't like, when we look at the rivers here and after summer, right, and it's getting close to where we're going to have the fall come, right? And you go out there, my brother sings a song of beaches of dry sand where all of a sudden the rivers, the water level goes down, you got these nice sandy beaches out in the middle of the river. And so it's at a low stage. Well, this is definitely not low stage. It was high stage. So this was an amazing work of God. And this is going to add to the threat and the fear of the people as they see what God is going to do. So they cross over and they're going to come into Gilgal, and as we're going to set up, and you can see that Jericho is just down to the south of it, and they're going to set up there as their base camp before they enter in and conquer Jericho. But God's going to have them do something first. First, the men are going to be circumcised before they go into battle. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Interesting. All right? I mean, if you think about it militarily, everything was primed. I mean, from a human perspective, this is the time to go in and attack. Rahab has already said that everyone's hearts melted, fear and trembling are there. Why not go in and take over? And why not go in and sack them? I mean, this is a great time to do it. Not only that, but, they've heard about the Red Sea crossing. That's sitting in their minds as they're thinking about the nation of Israel. Not only just think the number of people. I mean, you've got almost 2 million people sitting on the other side of the river ready to come into your land, and they've already destroyed those who were on the other side of the river, the Amorite kings, right? And they weren't some mediocre powers. These were major forces, and they took them out completely, and they settled their land. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were going to settle there on the agreement that they would build fortified cities for their families, but then they would go over and fight in the battle. And once it was done and they had conquered what they needed to conquer, then they would come back and resettle with their families. But these were no insignificant kings. Not only that, but then Yahweh has dried up the Jordan River, and they've crossed over on dry ground, and news had spread and fear had spread along with it. This is a great time, humanly speaking, to go in there and take them out. And God says, no, I want the men to be circumcised first. There needs to be consecration. This wasn't just any kind of warfare. It wasn't like one people group who expanded out of their boundary and they needed bigger boundaries, and so they're driving people out because they need more space. This was a holy war, and therefore they needed to be prepared, and there needed to be consecration before they went in and fought this battle. This was not to be some sort of ordinary battle, and so therefore it was to happen in God's timing when God was ready for them to do so, and the first battle was going to be His. And that sets the primer really for us when we have the next part of the campaign in chapters 7 and 8. Because God's going to give them strict instructions as far as Jericho is concerned of what they could and could not do. And it was not obeyed because Achan disobeyed the ban that was put on Jericho. And he took some things he was not supposed to take and hid them under his tent. And therefore, when they went up against Ai, they were defeated. All right? They were chased away. And God warned them. Right? So we have the preparation for war, and then we have the war of conquest starting in chapter 5, verse 13 through 12:24. And again, 12:24 is where we're given the summation of the kings, the 31 kings that Joshua had taken out. We have the captain of the hosts of the Lord in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. And I love this. You look at the time that God comes and appears to Moses. He does so in what? A burning bush. Right? He's a shepherd. He's out in the hills. How are you going to come to him? You're going to meet him where he's at. And that's exactly what God did. So here's Joshua, a soldier, a warrior. He's going into battle, and how does God appear to him? Right? Captain of the host of the Lord. And both of them exhorted that which they are standing on is holy ground. They are to remove the shoes from their feet, the sandals from their feet. Verse 14, and he said, no, rather indeed, come now as a captain, a host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the ground, or to the earth, and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? And the captain, Lord of hosts, said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Now, right? Now we're ready. Now we're ready for conquest. Now we're ready for warfare. The stage is set. So we have the central campaign, and this is the first one. This is the conquest of Jericho. That is the first. And this runs all the way into chapter 8, verse 35. So we have the defeat, chapter 7 of Ai. And then we're going to have the conquest of Ai, but we begin with the victory over Jericho, and these are the remains, if you will, of that territory. It's amazing. It never ceases to amaze me how much historical evidence we have to what we have recorded in the Word of God. It's astounding. And we're finding stuff all the time. I just received an email from Master's Seminary, where I'm an alumni, and they just discovered another great discovery that helped fix some dating. A great archaeological find, and there were a couple men from the school who were part of that, one of the professors who was a part of this find, this discovery. But it's just amazing. We keep finding things that just affirm over and over that what we read here is true. Right? And it is factual, and we don't have to doubt it. We can put all our confidence and trust in it because it is sure. So we have the conquest of Ai that comes in chapter 7, verse 1 through 8:29. But first it is the defeat because of Achan's sin, and then eventually the conquest. They get things right. The thing that astounded me about this situation with Achan was the impact that it had. It wasn't just on him. So God had put a ban on Jericho. Everything is mine. You keep nothing. Other conflicts, right, they would go in and they would have freedom to take certain things from the city when they would destroy it and take it over. They had the booty that they could distribute among themselves. God permitted that to happen. In Jericho, he put a ban on it, right? It's my city. Because this was his battle, and he wanted them to understand that fact. But Achan did not listen to God's commands. And Joshua's already cautioned, right? You will have victory so long as you are obedient to my law and you obey my commands. The moment that you don't, there is defeat. And so it's exactly what we see with Ai. And Ai was a piddly little city compared to Jericho and others. And yet, their men were driven off. So in chapter 7, verse 22 and following, let's go up actually to verse 19 of chapter 7. It says, then Joshua said to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done, and do not hide it from me. And Achan answered Joshua, verse 20, and said, truly I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. So he goes on to explain that he had taken some 100 shekels, he had taken of silver, a bar of gold, and so on, and he had hidden these things under his tent. So they go, verse 22 and following. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was concealed in his tent with silver underneath it. They took them, notice, they took them from inside the tent and brought them to Joshua and to all the sons of Israel, and they poured them out before the Lord. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, the silver, the mantle, the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that belonged to him. And they brought them up in the valley of Achor. Joshua said, why have you troubled us? And the Lord will trouble you this day. And all Israel stoned them with stones, and then they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that stands to this day. And the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger, and therefore the name of that place had been called the Valley of Achor, which is the Valley of Trouble to this day. It wasn't just Achan, right? It was Achan's sons, Achan's daughters, his sheep, his cattle, his tent. They stoned them all, and then they torched everything and burned it. It's interesting that the impact of the sin wasn't just upon him, it was upon his family around him, right? The consequences spread. And it's interesting, so often I think, forget thinking, some of the amazing truths in the Old Testament, how sin can be passed down from one generation to the next. And that's part of the reason why they had to destroy even the children of the land, not just the parents, because they were going to be steeped in their beliefs. They were going to be steeped in their worship and so on. And in those days, family was so important that when you would grow up and you would find out that your parents were killed by a certain people group, then you were going to level war against them, right? And pay back what you did to my family. And that's how they did. And so essentially they had to be eradicated. It's just interesting to see the connection that happens in regards to Achan, that it didn't just impact him, it impacted his whole household. God takes sin very seriously. So after that done then, chapter 8, we have the conquest of Ai. Now they can go up against Ai, and now they will have victory. And this is what was left of Ai after it had been conquered and taken over. And then we have the covenant ceremony at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And this is interesting because this was the instructions that were given to Moses back in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 1 through 26, and now they're being carried out here. But this is interesting in chapter 8, verse 30 and following, that Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as is written in the book of law of Moses, an altar, uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool. And they offered up burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And they're going to go up on the mountain. They're going to have the reading of the law, and the people are going to be positioned and according to the mountain. Verse 33, following, all Israel and their elders, officers, their judges, were standing on both sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and the stranger as well as the native. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, the other half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given them command in the first to bless the people of Israel. And that's where we had back in the chapters 27, 28 of Deuteronomy, the blessings and the cursings. And so here we have Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim, and they're going to be wedged in that valley, right? Some lined up by one, some lined up by the other. And this is how they're going to be part of their preparation as they come into the land, give them proper perspective in regards to the blessings and the cursings. It's amazing the things that God does. I mean, just the tangible lessons and the tangible things that God does to prep them for what they are to do. And yet, with all of that, right, of all of that, they still fail. They still fail. So we have the southern campaign that begins in the beginning part of chapter 9 of Joshua. We're going to be given a brief summary end of chapter 11. But unfortunately, the incident Ai, not only the failure of Israel, they also failed to ask the Lord to counsel in chapter 9, verse 14, so they entered into a covenant and they were not supposed to do, right? They were not supposed to enter into any kind of treaties with the people of the land. They were deceived. They did not seek God's counsel, and so therefore they fell for the deception, and they entered into a covenant with the Gibeonites, and who were within the border of the promised land. They weren't supposed to do that, but God used even that failure to open up the southern part of the land. City after city, they fell before Joshua and the Israelites. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 43. And this takes us into chapter 11. We have the northern campaign. The end of chapter 11, we have a little bit of a summary starting in chapter 11, verse 16 and following. And then we have the more extensive summary that happens in chapter 12. But in order for Israel in order to repel Israel, the remnants of the southern land, they're going to join whatever kings they could. So they muster up some mighty kings of the north. They formed an alliance to face Joshua. And this was like no other battle that they had ever faced. In chapter 11, verses 4 and 5, it says, and they came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore, and very many horses and chariots. And so all of these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And this was going to be a conflict they never had before. But, I mean, just the description, as much as the sand on the seashore, right? I mean, you just imagine the massive amount of troops that were out there. And Israel's going to go, okay, we're going to go fight these guys? All right. But God encourages them, though, in verses 6 and following, chapter 11. Then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. So you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war went and came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, so that they defeated them, and they pursued them as far as the great Sidon. And they're going to go and follow the Lord's instructions. In verse 9, Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him, and he hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. So even though they faced this great adversity and this great army, God still gave them victory as long as they were obedient to him. So we have the summary of the conquest, and then we have the list of defeated kings from the east and the west in chapter 12. And then we have the division of the land. And you can go through these chapters on their own. They're pretty well laid out as Joshua has given us this record. But he's given the instruction at the beginning of chapter 13 that he is to divide up the land. So he gives this command in chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. He's going to divide up the land east of the Jordan River in 13:8 through 33. He's going to give the division of land to the west of the Jordan in 14:1 through 19:51. So he's going to fulfill what God has given him to do. He has conquered the major kings, the major cities. He's accomplished that. He's now going to allot the land. He's going to divide it up among the different tribes. He's going to establish the cities of refuge in chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. And that is for those unintentional, right, murders that take place. There's the city of refuge you can run to and find safety. And then we have the towns for the Levites in 21:1 through 42. And then the fulfilled promises of the Lord, 21:43 through 45. And with this, essentially, Joshua has fulfilled his task that God has given him to do. And so it'll be time for him now to then depart, right? He's finished his course. He's run his race. And it will be time for him to go. So he's going to divide up the land in these chapters, starting in chapter 13 into 19. We have those on the side of the land of Canaan, divide up between the tribes. You have the half tribe Manasseh there. And then on the other side, we have Gad, Reuben, and the other half tribe Manasseh who are going to settle in that part of the region. And so they're going to go back in the latter part of Joshua's book, and they're going to go back and settle their land now that they have gone through and they fought the battles with their fellow community, right? And they have given them what they need. So they now enter into the land. They're going to have life in the land, 22:1 through 24:33. We have the eastern tribes return to the Transjordan. Joshua's farewell address to the leaders, 23:1 through 16. And then Joshua's final charge to the people, 24:1 through 28. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, right? I mean, that's the great. That's the plaque you see in almost every Christian home, right? Do you know the thing about Joshua is you read about his life and see everything, and you know that this was not a slogan phrase for Joshua, right? He meant what he said. And we have the 3 burials in the land of Canaan, 24:29 through 33. So Joshua's task is done. He has finished what he has been given to do. Israel, in regards to the land of Canaan, or land of promise, Israel to the land, they've had this long journey. 40 years of discipline, wilderness wanderings, but nonetheless they finally get to the land. They're finally in the land. And then we're going to see these downward spirals in which eventually it's going to lead to them being out of the land in 3-fold phase of deportation, starting in 605 and ending in 586. So next week, Judges and Ruth we will look at together collectively. And we'll try to get through both of them together, hopefully. So we can keep this moving along. Any questions?